Hi everyone, my name is Grace Smith and today I'm going to tell you about the founding of the Stratford Festival back in 1953. I have a PhD in theatre from the University of Toronto. I also have this blazer, so I'm very qualified to talk about this. Before I begin, here are some of the main sources I'm using for this video. First Stage, The Making of the Stratford Festival, written by Tom Patterson, who's the founder. Later Stages, Essays in Ontario Theatre from the First World War to the 1970s. My Part in the Stratford Adventure by Tyrone Guthrie, who was the first artistic director. Some newspapers and magazines from the time period, and my own dissertation. If you hear noises, it's my cat's eating. Stratford is a small city in Ontario. It's located on the Avon River. The city and the river were named after Shakespeare's birthplace, Stratford upon Avon. Stratford is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples. The territory there is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. The Stratford Festival had its first season in the summer of 1953. There were actually several professional theatres that popped up in Ontario after World War II, and the Stratford Festival is the only one that still exists today. In fact, it's the only one that lasted longer than a decade. Keeping a professional theatre afloat is hard. The Stratford Festival was started by Tom Patterson, this guy. He was born in Stratford, Ontario, and grew up there. He served in Europe in World War II and studied at Trinity College at the University of Toronto. He then worked in Toronto for a trade magazine, Maclean's Hunters Civic Administration. Why did Tom Patterson have the idea for the festival? Patterson realized Stratford would need a new industry soon. Before the 1950s, Stratford's major industries were railroad related. It was a railway junction. Patterson says in his book First Stage, "We understood it would simply be a matter of time until the giant steam engine repair shops, which my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather once worked in, and on which the town depended, would be put to rest." With Stratford being named after Shakespeare's birthplace, Patterson thought a Shakespeare Festival would make sense from a marketing perspective, and if successful, it would make the main industry of Stratford arts and culture and tourism. I think one of the most interesting things about this story is that Tom Patterson was not a theater person. He was not a theater creator or really a theater fan. He was a journalist who admits in his book First Stage that he had never been to a live performance when he started pursuing the idea for the festival. He hadn't even heard of most of the theater companies or artists operating in Canada. But of course, growing up in a place called Stratford, you're very aware of Shakespeare. In some ways, I think this actually helped him. He started by going to local government for approval, and soon after that, he would pursue big names in the arts and culture world, while the existing theatre in Ontario was going about things quite differently. So, what other theatre was happening in Ontario at the time? Before World War II, there was a lot of amateur community theatre, but almost no professional theatre in Ontario or in most of Canada. There were touring productions from the USA and from the UK. After World War II, a number of professional theatres opened in Ontario, though most of them didn't last very long. The New Play Society was founded in Toronto in 1946 by Dora Mavor Moore and her son Mavor Moore. Confusing, I know. Dora was already known in Toronto for her highly skilled amateur theatre, the Village Players. The Canadian Repertory Theatre was founded in 1949 and was the only professional Canadian company located in Ottawa until it closed in 1955. This company did pay its staff a living wage, as it had patrons providing funds, and it operated at a breakneck speed, opening a new production every week. There was the Straw Hat Players. They were a summer theatre company in Muskoka, which was founded in 1948. There was the Jupiter Theatre that was founded in Toronto in 1951 by a collective of well-known local actors and writers. The company loudly committed to only producing new Canadian plays. It would unfortunately only last 3 seasons, closing in 1954 due to financial troubles. Most of these examples were operating on a shoestring budget, hoping to develop a paying audience so they could bring in more box office in future seasons. Despite the existence of these companies, there was no professional theatre industry in Ontario when the Stratford Festival was founded. How do you set up a professional theatre without a professional industry? A lot of what makes something professional is either legality or convention. For legality, that means like having a license, like a doctor or lawyer needs. But a lot of professionalism is convention. What are other professional theaters doing? What terminology are other professionals using? What are the standard professional theater practices? How have other professional companies gotten started? Let's do what they did. But there was none of that for theater in Canada in 1953. You would have to set precedents, not follow them. Patterson describes how all these professionals started work on the festival with little guarantee of anything. At the beginning, as I have noted, there was no money whatsoever. Indeed, in the early stages, there were no contracts. Alec Guinness's arrived from his agents in England well into the playing period, but this did not stop him from working. There wasn't even a precedent for ticket prices for this sort of large-scale production, so Patterson turned to the US. We went to downtown Toronto and bought a New York Times and looked through its entertainment section. After scouring all the ads, we found the theater which charged the highest prices. Those became our prices. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. How did Tom Patterson actually found the Stratford Festival? Patterson pitched the idea to the Stratford City Council and he was given a small sum of money to investigate the idea. There's a January 1952 article of the Stratford Beacon Herald which describes this council meeting. From an industrial standpoint, Stratford has been at a standstill, said Alderman Bert Davies. And if we can build it up as a cultural center, I certainly think we are on the right track. I'm in favor of an investigation into its possibilities and having Mr. Patterson bring his report back to council. The other members of the council all agreed that it was worth investigating, and not one voice was raised against the up to $125 expense money. Patterson traveled to New York to try and pitch the idea to Laurence Olivier, who he was unfortunately unable to get a meeting with, mostly because he had no plan for how to get a meeting with him. Instead, he ended up meeting with Boyd Neal, a world-famous orchestra conductor. I went with some trepidation. After all, this was my first meeting with an international star, and one from Shakespeare's native land. We sat in the lobby of the hotel, and I outlined the whole idea with great enthusiasm. To my delight, he was even more interested in my idea than several of the Canadians I had talked with had been. Our conversation gave me a great boost. Now I could say that an international star from England agreed with the idea. This story is pretty typical of Patterson's approach as he describes it in First Stage. He would get in-person meetings with as many important people, government or arts, as he could, and being a journalist helped with this. Then he'd get them to verbally agree that his festival idea was a good idea. Finally, he could go on to the next person he needed support from and say, well, so-and-so said they thought it was a great idea. He essentially built up the foundation of the festival on well wishes and promises of support. Eventually, Tom Patterson got in touch with Mavor Moore and his mother, Dora Mavor Moore, of the New Play Society in Toronto. This was really his first contact with Canadian theatre artists in his quest to found the festival. Dora recommended that Patterson get in touch with Tyrone Guthrie, who she believed was one of the greatest directors of Shakespeare alive. Patterson wrote a letter to Guthrie in the spring of 1952, first emphasizing how hungry for professional live performance Canadians were. When a ballet comes to Toronto, it is impossible to obtain seats after about 2 days of ticket sales. The Metropolitan Opera played to the largest crowd in its history last month, an average of 11,500 per night. Mrs. Mavor Moore's production of Spring Thaw played to nearly 100,000 people in a 5-week run just concluded. Patterson also appealed to the director's sense of artistic independence. There is absolutely nothing to start with, so that whoever does produce the festival will have no traditions to overcome, and what is more, no local thespians who have their own ideas. Now, Patterson still did not have much money for the festival. I believe at this point he was still working off the $125 that the council had promised him. So when it came time to negotiate Guthrie's fee for just visiting to discuss the possibility of a festival, Patterson was nervous. He didn't want to insult the famous director by offering too low, but he couldn't afford to offer very high. The phone call proceeded as such. The question of Guthrie's fee arose again, and in spite of the fact that he had been given no authority, Patterson offered him $500. For a minute or two there was silence on the line, and then Guthrie said that would be fine. It was not until the director arrived that Patterson discovered that the telephone line had gone dead at the moment he uttered the amount, and Guthrie never knew what he was to be paid. Without knowing his fee, Guthrie visited Stratford, Ontario, and he would become the festival's first artistic director. But wait a second. Why was Guthrie even interested in founding a festival in Canada? Basically, Guthrie was excited by the idea of directing Shakespeare in an environment where there wouldn't be a lot of tradition to fight against. He could create the productions he wanted without any naysayers because he was the expert in the room. He wanted to have his say, which also meant some more established Ontario theatre artists were not as involved in the festival as they might have liked. Guthrie also seemed genuinely excited to help develop Canadian theatre towards professionalism. Guthrie gave a public talk in his first visit to Stratford where he discussed the other theatres in Canada. They have, I know, done good and even distinguished work, but in the amateur field. They have not so far been able to offer either a living wage or, not less important, a full life's work to more than a tiny handful of people. Guthrie and Patterson did hire Canadians for a lot of roles, both on and off stage. For the lead in Richard III, they went to British actor Alec Guinness. Yes, Obi-Wan Kenobi. The festival needed a star to draw attention and add legitimacy, so Guthrie wrote to Guinness about the festival, assuring him of its viability and importance. Finance. This, I am convinced, will not be hard to find. Your name will guarantee that the project is not just a small-town jamboree. What interests me particularly about this is that I'm convinced it's the right moment. If Stratford doesn't do it, some other Canadian community will. Canada's bursting with money. This seemed to convince Guinness, as he came to Stratford to start rehearsals and opened the show without his contract even having arrived. Where did the money for the festival come from? There was no Canada Council for the Arts yet, so there was no typical way for a theatre venture to get money from the government. Guthrie, Patterson, and the festival committee agreed that this would have to be a large-scale production to succeed. The festival idea wouldn't work with the shoestring, low-budget model that other Ontario professional theatres were using. So, how did they do it? A combination of some small government contributions, less than $6,000, and most of that from the city of Stratford, and donations. They relied very heavily on donations. A lot of donations came from Stratford itself. A campaign for funds was launched, which outlined the following reasons the festival would benefit the people of Stratford. 1. It will advertise the city, as it has already done, over the whole North American continent, as well as in England. 2. With a conservative estimate of 30,000 people coming into the city, it will mean an extra income of at least $150,000 to our merchants and citizens. As well as ourselves, it will give our children and our children's children an opportunity to see some of the best theatre in the world. 4. It will completely reverse the usual trend in Stratford's summer. Instead of everybody leaving the city, everybody will be coming in. The festival also received some larger donations from wealthy families like the Masseys. One last money-related thing that I find interesting. Guthrie was constantly trying to set a precedent for how theatre professionals should be paid in Canada. He demanded a fee for appearing on a radio program when he was doing media promotion for the festival. It was all part of Tyrone Guthrie's contribution to establishing the Stratford Festival as a professional theatre. If he was to take part in a radio program, then he had to get the going fee or better. It did not matter how much he was paid. If they had offered $1,000, he would have asked for $2,000. But they offered $25, so he asked for $50. Despite some very close calls on the money front, and there were definitely some times where it looked like the festival would not happen, the first season opened and was a success. The two productions that season were Richard III and All's Well That Ends Well, and apart from Alec Guinness and American actress Irene Worth, the majority of the cast was Canadian. And that's where I'll leave it for today. If you want to know more about how that first season of the Stratford Festival went, I'd be happy to make another video. Just comment and let me know. You can also learn more by watching the Oscar-nominated documentary about the first season of the Stratford Festival. It's available on YouTube in its entirety. I will post a link in the comments, or just search for the Stratford Adventure on YouTube. So glad that my blazer got its moment in the sun today.